Can I call on the first panel member? I would say of all of these panellists is that they're all people who've devoted a major part of their working lives to considering the sort of issues that you are concerned about today. Our first commentator is Antony Green, who would be well known to many of you because of his television appearances. He knows a great deal about the electoral system, our electoral system, other electoral systems and how it works, and I welcome Antony Green.
Good morning. Looking at the proposals which have come forward so far, what fascinates me is how much people seem to want to get rid of duplication and somehow produce a centralised system with lots of uniformity. But then people complain also about accountability. And what struck me so far is that in attempting to get single layers of government and uniformity, somewhere along the line we're losing local decision making. If you've got uniformity across the whole country in laws, how much scope is there for local decision-making if the laws are uniform everywhere? I know there are problems with federation and with states and different layers of government and upper and lower houses, and people don't seem to like this sort of differentiation. But on the other side of that, it is actually something which makes life, increases liberty to an extent in Australia. Now, democracy works not just by voting. It's a system of rules within which voting takes place. And in a democratic society, we elect our rulers. I mean, remember what people like Robert Mugabe does. He just has an election. If he doesn't win it, he just carries on. But he feels he has to have an election because if you don't have elections, if you don't have people having a say in who rules them, what right do the people who govern have to say they rule? Who are they ruling if they don't get the will of the people? So even dictatorships go through the shams of elections because elections and appealing to say, I represent the people, I'm doing things for the people, is the way you legitimate yourself as a government. Even a dictator feels the need to do that. So for the cynicism about democracy, I always like to remind people of that. Secondly, before I move on to voting, it's important to consider the structure of power that goes on between the governed and government. And there's various ways you can try and limit that. I mean, in America, they elect a president who is extremely powerful, but constitutionally, they divide the power he governs. In Britain, they elect a parliament which elects a prime minister, but because there are so constitutional restrictions, they basically have an elected dictatorship. Once the government's there, there's not much you can do about it. Compare Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand has no constitution, no states, no upper house, and until recently, a first-past-the-post electoral system. Once the government was elected, it had 3 years to basically do what it liked. And in the 1980s, governments did do what they liked, often exactly the opposite of what they'd promised to do before the election. And after 10 years of that, the people of New Zealand were so cynical that their party system was collapsing, as people were saying, well, it doesn't matter who we vote for, you do something else anyway. And when they got the opportunity, they changed their electoral system to limit what government could do. In Australia, we went through the same period of economic change, but we had states, we had a Senate, we had a constitution, we had a High Court. Change took longer, but what didn't fall apart was trusting government in the same way and the political party system. To get a GST through or to sell Telstra was a process that took years. It was debated thoroughly, and by the time it occurred, there was general acceptance that this was going to happen. In New Zealand, they just said, we're doing it, and they just did it, and sometimes they got it wrong. Fast, quick, efficient government doesn't necessarily make right, accountable, and efficient, and government which produces the right decision-making. Quick decision-making isn't necessarily right decision-making. That's the first thing I'd say. So I think in looking at the proposals that are being put forward, I think the one thing I would say is that don't just discount states, don't just discount local government, don't go totally for uniformity, because people in Western Australia have different views of how they want their water rules governed from people who live in Queensland or South Australia. If you just have one level of government, that sort of level of decision-making just disappears because one single level of government doesn't necessarily have that ability to do things differently across the whole country. So in designing what you want Australia to look like, that's one point I'd make. Secondly, don't discount the role of things like the Senate and state upper houses. We inherited those institutions, particularly the states. There was something we inherited from Britain and couldn't get rid of, except for Queensland, who did abolish their upper house. And over time, we've adopted a different electoral system for the upper house, so it's elected differently from the lower house. and government has been made more accountable by not controlling upper houses. As Fred was reminding me earlier, the Howard government in its last term got control of the Senate for the first time and was able to do things without having to be forced to modify legislation by the upper house. And probably that was the reason it lost the last election. It went further than the public was prepared to accept because it had got control of both houses. So when people complain about bickering going on between politicians and levels of government and houses of parliament, don't forget that this is a soft way of actually dividing power and forcing government to explain debate. Martin will discuss things like Bill of Rights, which is defining the power of the individual versus government. But don't forget that there are divisions of parliament, divisions of levels of government, which are very useful ways of dividing liberty in a country, and I think they shouldn't be discounted. As far as electoral systems are concerned, there are many different ways you can look at an electoral system. I notice there are various proposals put forward for first past the post, for proportional representation, for quota systems, to get rid of preferences, to make preferences more accountable, to make parties more accountable. Most of those ideas are contradictory as set down here, and the problem is in designing an electoral system, you're trying to meet several aims at once. If you've got citizens' initiative referendum and you want accountable government at the same time, you find that accountable government is difficult because their hands are constantly tied by the referendums that are passed. California is one of the great states for citizens' initiative referendum, and they elect governments which basically can't control their own budget because 80% of the budget has been tied by referendums. So how accountable is a government that can't actually deal with most of the spending problems it has because they've been tied by referendums? So there are difficulties you get in making government, in using citizens' initiative referendum to get people involved. And of course, the more you have referendums, the less people vote because they keep being asked to vote all the time. In Switzerland, the more referendums they have, the turnout drops. Because people don't want to turn up and vote and understand every proposal which comes up all the time. So there are contradictions trying to get accountable government with citizens' initiative referendum and trying to have government which is accountable through elections to the people. Because sometimes you can't hold them accountable because their hands are tied by referendums. So there's that problem. If you do have constitutions, and I was talking about voting occurs within rules, it's important that you define the rules under which things occur. And you can't be too prescriptive in constitutional terms. When you're writing constitutions and rules, they have to be relatively general to cope with change over time. Our constitution is 100 years old. There are some bits of it which are quite anachronistic, but it's generally relatively flexible for a variety of reasons. You can't be too over-prescriptive in constitutional things. If you want an electoral system, how proportional do you want to make it, or how much do you want to make it so a government gets a clear majority? So the difficulty is do you want an elective dictatorship, or do you want a government which has to continue to come back to people and argue their points of view? The clearer and more undivided you make government, the more you have one chamber of parliament govern the whole country, the more you get an elective dictatorship, because it doesn't have to explain what it's doing necessarily, it just does it, because there's nothing to stop it, to force it to argue. Having a Senate and having states forces government to argue their point of view. And my comparison again is New Zealand and Australia. When they sold Telstra or introduced the GST, in New Zealand they just did it. Now some people might like that, other people might want to have the argument. And in Australia the argument was forced because we have a structure which forces the debate to go on, because you've got to get through different levels of government. You've got to get through 2 houses of parliament. So again, they're trade-offs you have. You can have stronger government, but it might be less accountable, or it's only accountable once every 3 or 4 years. Thank you. I knew I'd end up sort of rushing through my points. That would be one thing. You also have representative majorities versus minorities. If you have single-member electorates, you're less likely to get minorities represented. You're more likely to get individual areas represented. But when you talk about people, do people feel an affinity only to the people they live around, or do they feel affinity to other people of their ethnic group or their class? Single-member electorates aren't very good at representing things which aren't geographic. They sort of get it. But if you go down the path of proportional representation, you get less local representation, but you get better representation of things like class and ethnicity and things like that. And finally, a word about parties, and John will go more into parties. Parties are very good at aggregating interests. I know people don't like them, But a parliament of independents would have the same problem of trying to allocate resources across the country. And parties are quite good at resolving those arguments and trying to deal with those debates. And these issues are very complex. And I hope I've put a few points there, and 10 minutes has caught me out. Thank you very much.